Back in the 1980s, an Episcopal priest by the name of Terry Fuller tells the story of his transition from being in academia to going back to the local parish. He says that when he was called back to the church, he did all the necessary kinds of preparations and then got ready for his very first Sunday. And like every congregation, when a new minister comes to lead worship and to preach, the pews are packed with anticipation. He got up to the pulpit to preach his first sermon, and Father Fuller preached on an amazing topic, love. And in that, the congregation was moved. Part of them was relieved because they felt like they got someone who led a wonderful worship service and preached a good sermon. And they were just moved by the message itself. So at the end of the service, when Father Fuller was standing at the door, parishioners paraded out, shook Father Fuller's hand and said, "Thank you for such a lovely message. Father Fuller, you moved me today." So the next Sunday, Father Fuller came back and he preached the exact same sermon again. Now the people were a little taken aback. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, you know what? It was a really good sermon. It deserved a second showing. And so at the end of the service, when Father Fuller stood at the door shaking hands, people thanked him for his message and said, "Father Fuller, thank you for such a moving message." The third week, when he came back to the pulpit, he preached the exact same sermon on love again. Now the people were getting nervous, and the deacons of the church were especially critical of this. So they gathered in a side room to kind of discuss their next steps of approaching this problem. And they elected one of their senior elder members to approach Father Fuller on this. So here is this elder who went to Father Fuller. And when he did, he said, "Father Fuller, you have preached the exact same sermon 3 weeks in a row." And before this gentleman could go on, Father Fuller said, "That's right. And when we get this one right, we'll move on to the next." This is one of my favorite stories, and it has been a part of my heart for over 30 years. In fact, you might have heard it before because I actually used it as a part of a sermon that I preached at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Urbana-Champaign in August of 2018. And as we learned from Father Fuller, it is a story that bears repeating. You see, sometimes when we think about education, we believe that it's that thing that we learn anew. It's that new aha. It's that new insight. And as we integrate that new learning into our being, we shift who we are in a new direction. We become wiser. We are deeper. We're more connected to the world. I believe that's true, but I also fully believe in the deepest part of my being that some of the most important learning in our lifetime are those lessons that we need to learn over and over and over again. We take our entire life to fully integrate the fullness of that lesson. And so today, as we talk about education, as we talk about learning and its value and role, both in this congregation and in all congregations, I hope that you will keep that in mind. I could go back thousands of years to look at some of the historical landmarks of where education and learning and faith were developed. The Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures all have several places of documentation where those faith traditions lifted up values around education and learning. Instead, though, I figure you might have other things that you might want to do today. So let us start with the Protestant Reformation, which is marked by October 31st, 1517. Now, to be fair, the Protestant Reformation was a movement of several decades that went both before and after this one date. But that date became a symbolic place. You see, the Protestant Reformation emerged not just out of the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church of that time, but out of a sense that the values that the Roman Catholic Church held and the process in which they made God available to the people was wrong. So here is a group of clergy and lay leaders who are saying very clearly, Roman Catholic Church, your concept that the only way to get to God is through the church and through the priests, and that the only way that God speaks to the people, which is through the church and through the priests, is wrong. God and the people can speak and learn together without you as their interpreter or their conduit. That was the main message. And in that addressed much of the corruption that had arisen over the fact that the Roman Catholic Church controlled access to God and vice versa. So that message was one of those things that got a lot of people excited. And yet it's important to understand that one of the reasons that the people got excited was not just the message alone. The fact that this message was delivered in a new way, an invention that had come out of China from centuries ago, was reintroduced, reformatted, and reinvented in the 15th century, and it was called the printing press. This invention of the printing press, culminating with this movement, made the movement widespread. And that is an important marriage between two events to understand. You see, because of the printing press, Martin Luther and his colleagues could actually get the word out of what they were trying to do, what they were trying to say. And they also were able to have more Bibles printed. You see, people got excited. And in that excitement, they wanted to read the Bible from themselves. But to do that, they first had to learn to read. All of a sudden, literacy and values around education flew. It was a wonderful thing. So, what happens next? Over the next 100 years, a great movement of people from European countries over to this new world that would later be named the United States emerged. Boatloads of people started to come over. Now, think about this, because one of the things that people fled Europe for was the chance for religious freedom. People wanted to be able to worship God the way they felt was right and not have that dictated by the church and state. And so here is the excitement of the Protestant Reformation, this new learning on reading and being able to interpret the Bible, and people coming in droves over to this new land. When the churches of that northern New England area started to emerge, they emerged with this concept in mind. And all those Congregationalist congregations in that area developed a dual minister, a shared ministry system. Each of them had two ministers, a minister of education and a minister of proclamation. A scholar by the name of Virgil Phelps went into about 25 to 40 of these congregations, dug through all of their historical records, and made note of what was the job description for both of these ministers. He found astounding things. For example, they were equal. They shared the ministry. They had very separate duties. The minister of education was the interpreter of the scriptures. The minister of proclamation orated those interpretations. They both did pastoral care. They both served the elements and did communion and other liturgies. They both were paid the same based on experience. If you go back and look, you can see very detailed parts of what each of them was to do. And they shared those roles, not in sharing each other's job description, but in working together with their very distinct identities. This worked very well for about 100 years, maybe a little bit more. In fact, one of our Unitarian Universalist historical documents, the Cambridge Platform, which outlines the polity of Congregationalists, has a snapshot of this dual ministry in it. There are several paragraphs which outline the minister of education and the minister of proclamation as dual and shared ministry roles. Now, that document informs Unitarian Universalist polity, which is the way that we are structured, the way we act together in community. It does not act out our theology because it comes out of a Christian theology, which is not where we have evolved to today. And yet that polity is important. And so in 1648, when the Cambridge Platform was published, here is the Minister of Education and the Minister of Proclamation working side by side. Now that died out by about 1723. And that is important also to know, because today we normally have one minister or a minister and associates. At that time that it was dying out, the Sunday school movement rose. This was a movement where many groups of people, some in the United States, some in England and other countries in Europe, discovered that education was a key avenue to help people leave poverty. And so Sunday schools were to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Some of the earliest ones were found in the New England area of these new colonies. But the story that I am the most impressed with is out of London and a gentleman by the name of Robert Raikes. One of the reasons is that Robert Raikes went into communities other than his own to get these Sunday schools started. And also, Robert Raikes tried to get all ages involved, children, youth, and adults. And the adults said, we are not ready. We do not have the bandwidth. We do not have that capacity. But please take our children, take our youth, because we hope that they have a better opportunity. And so that Sunday school movement began. Now, in about 100 years, that Sunday school movement started to die out, particularly in the United States, because universal education became a foundational component of what it meant to be a citizen in the United States. And if the government was going to make sure that all people were educated, then the Sunday schools did not have to do that. So they transitioned that work into basic Sunday school like we know today. Learning about religion, learning about ethics, learning about how to be a good person, learning about God. So those were kind of those transitions. Now, fascinatingly, universal education helps us to frame how we see our own Sunday school movement today. And I will talk about that later, but I want to kind of put a note right there. Now, one more person that needs to be talked about. We get to the 20th century, and a great Unitarian leader by the name of Sophia Lyon-Fahs emerges to help the dying Unitarian Sunday school movement to reformulate. She said clearly, one of the reasons that this is dying is because you are treating everybody the same. We need to make sure to give people and children and youth education that is appropriate for their age level and their development. And she developed curriculum, she did teacher trainings, she helped to reformulate Sunday school in such a way that it was age appropriate and therefore more engaging. And Sunday schools just flourished all over the country. Now we'll also talk about that. So today we have learning as a part of our congregations. Let us now reflect on this timeline. And when we come back together, we will look a little bit more closely as what these historical points in history mean for us, what they tell us, how they inform us, and then how it can help us to reflect on our religious education and our learning future. There is no doubt that there is much history that is important that we are not talking about today. It is my hope that this is a good start and a way to dig deeper. For every point in which I lifted up today could be its own sermon, could be its own religious education series of lessons. And maybe that's what we do. Maybe it's time for us to start studying these in depth. But before we move on today, I would like to talk a little bit about inclusivity and accessibility and the way in which we frame our culture around these historical points and how that affects us today. So the Protestant Reformation got learning going, and there was some excitement in that. And that continued for several hundred years, at least 200 years that we can mark. At the time in which the Sunday school movement was coming up, and even then another 100 years later when the universal education movement was flourishing, there was a systematic issues around racism and sexism and classism that influenced this history, and I dare say influence the way in which we see learning today. So let's go back, for example, to the rise of the universal movement of education in this country. At that point, there were men teachers. But because now education was in such high demand, there were not enough men to fill all the needed roles. And in addition, the men who were in those roles normally were not called to education. They were using education as a stepping stone to other careers like theology, ministry, or academia, or even being a lawyer. So with that, here we have a transient population of professionals who are teachers in a country that is saying that this is important. So one of the things that happened is that the field opened up to women to become teachers, and many women filled those roles, and all of a sudden you found communities with women teachers. Now that teaching was regulated highly. You go back through some of the records and see what the regulations around what it meant to be a teacher were. They're pretty striking. And so it's important to know that even though women were brought into the vocation, they still were regulated in such a way that they did not have the same freedoms, the same responsibility and authority as male teachers. And I believe that that not only speaks to the sexism which we still struggle with today, that it also speaks to the fact that we devalued learning because we already devalued women. And that it's important for us to note that, because to raise the status and awareness of women and their value and equality in the United States and the world is to raise education as well. And vice versa, to raise the value of education and learning in our world and our churches is another way to also raise women. And at some point, I would love to talk about how that even raises other places where we devalue people, because we devalue many groups of people, and it's time that we start paying closer attention to that. One of those populations that has always struggled with being devalued are children and youth. Now, I will not dig into that because, like I said, that in itself is a 7-part series, if not beyond. But let us note that today, as we hold the value of women, the value of children, and the value of education, that we might not be unpacking all of it, but we do hold them in our hearts and know that we have more work to do to study and learn and understand. Now, let me go back to that point in the 20th century around Sophia Lyon-Fahs, because there's an important thing to know for that. Sophia Lyon-Fahs did bring to us an amazing gift, and that was that of age-appropriate Sunday school. And her foundational lessons served to develop further curriculums that were even better and better, and that still influence what we use today. However, I do believe that at that moment when she gave us that gift, and it was a gift, she also gave us a little bit of a curse. And that curse is the one where we separate out children and youth from the life of the worshiping community so far that they are now seen in separate parts of the building. They rarely ever even join with us in that central place that congregations have discerned to be the primary place of gathering, worship. And when that happens, now they are seen less, they're more invisible, and they have lesser value. For anybody who does not have accessibility or invitation into worship, when it is the central part of the community, and for us it is, then they are being excluded and devalued. And that's an important thing to know. Now, I want to hold up that Sophia Lyon-Fahs' gifts were important, even if they did have a bit of a curse that we need to address. We will always need places where peer groups gather together to learn, to relate. And at the same time, we need to make sure that our central gathering places are places fully open and fully welcome to all ages, all people, no matter what. So what does this mean for us as we go into a year of discernment about the role of learning and education at the Life of Unitarian Universalist Church of Urbana-Champaign? And another question that is similar but separate is, where do children and youth fit into this? Those two questions are ones I hope that you will hold into your heart. What is the value of learning? I am biased. I will own it. Education is my call. It is the path that I use to get to the holy, to the divine, to the sacred. That is not true for everybody. And yet I always want to lift up that vessel and ask that question. Where is it that learning reaches the deepest part of who you are? So, my friends, I ask you to take that with you today. Take this reflection and look at learning, its marriage to populations that have been devalued. Today we talked about women and children, but those are not the only ones. And in that, hold them as we, as a community, continue this conversation. Thank you, and blessed be.